Hello everybody, a warm welcome to Budget Basics. February, this calendar month of every year, is a year where state governments or central government do present budgets. It is very important that we understand the basics of budget. So welcome to all of you to the class on Budget Basics. So, what is the necessity for Budget Basics? Before we get into what has happened in this year's budget, what is different, what is the vision, what is the ideas, it is important for us to understand what is a budget, what does a budget try to explain. In a larger idea of economics, what is the role of budget? In this perspective, today's class on Budget Basics. Let's begin. Budget is largely a part of fiscal policy. Now, fiscal policy is a macroeconomic policy. When we understand economics from a competitive exam perspective, we look at macroeconomics. Fiscal policy and monetary policy are two important macroeconomic policies. Now, specific to fiscal policy deals with the incoming receipts or revenues, outgoing expenditures. So, what are the different revenues and expenditures? What is the nature of revenues and expenditure? How do we largely try to match them with respect to the vision, with respect to the goals of a particular country? This is the whole idea of what is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is a very important aspect of macroeconomics. Now, the next question, why does any country need a fiscal policy? This is very important to understand. Fiscal policy determines what is the larger size of any economy. In that sense, what are the goals that we are trying to meet? What is the nature of economic development that you can plan? From that perspective, it is also important to ensure that there is a sectoral balance, because regional development and regionally balanced development becomes important. So how do you ensure regional balance? This is also the idea of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy also deals with debt management, because debt management becomes very crucial. In the overall idea, fiscal policy ensures that there is intergenerational equity. Intergenerational equity is a previous year question if you look at UPSC mains. So how do we understand intergenerational equity is how do we manage the economy in general? So, while we understand the what and why of fiscal policy, we also need to look at who makes the fiscal policy. That is a very interesting question. Having now understood what and why of fiscal policy, we will now come to a very interesting question of who makes fiscal policy. Now, this is interesting because the idea of who can be of multiple options. Necessarily, the government can make fiscal policy because it is the ultimate body. Also, the idea of revenues, expenditures can be dealt by an expert body like RBI. It is the central bank of the country. Why not? We have a constitutional body called Fiscal Finance Commission under Article 280. So, why not? Further, you can also have any external body dealing with the same. An external expert body can also do the same. The question is who actually makes fiscal policy? It is critical because this question of who is important because this involves critical decision making. Now, decision making in terms about who decides of how much of revenues, how much of expenditures, and where exactly are we spending this? So this important decision making needs to be done by whom? And this decision making can be done by none other than the government. Why? Because it is the government which has the legitimacy. Government has the legitimacy that people have bestowed upon by voting them to power. So the people have given the legitimacy to government by electing them. That makes it specific that only and only the government can make fiscal policy. Now that we have understood it is only the government that can make fiscal policy, the specific question, who exactly in the government? In the government, it is the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of Finance exclusively is responsible for the fiscal policy. Let's get a little detail about Ministry of Finance. It's a large ministry with 5 different departments. Which are the departments? We have Department of Economic Affairs. Department of Economic Affairs is the primary department. Apart from that, we have Department of Revenue, we have Department of Expenditure, and we also have Department of Financial Services. Now, apart from that, we have one other department which has recently been renamed, which is called Department of Investment and Public Asset Management. Earlier, this department was called Department of Disinvestment. Now, the change of idea from disinvestment to investment and public asset management is a thought. So these are the 5 different departments of Ministry of Finance. Among these departments, it is the Department of Economic Affairs which is exclusively responsible both for the budget and for the economic survey. It is important to note, in the year 2024, the government has not presented the economic survey. Let's stick to the discussion on budget. Now, we have understood what, why and who about fiscal policy. The government only should make fiscal policies amply clear. Now, let's get to the further understanding. Now, the question is, what is the tool using which we make fiscal policy? No doubt, the tool for fiscal policy is the budget. Now, the questions repeat again. So, in that case, what is budget? Budget, in simple terms, is an estimation. Now, why do I use the term estimation? Budget is an estimation of revenues and expenditures of a country. Now, in general, the term budget can be something that can be done for an individual, for an organization, for a family, and similarly for a country or a state. So, budget is an estimation. Now, why specifically the word estimation? It is estimation because we are looking at the upcoming year, we are looking at the future. So, this year, when we presented the budget was presented for the year 2024-25. That is why the budget is an estimation. However, if it was the economic survey would be a status document of the year 2023-24 that is gone by. So this is how we understand budget is an estimation of revenue and expenditure, and that estimation of revenue and expenditure, we do it for a period of time, and generally we do it annually. So it's an annual estimation that we come about. So before we get in further, let's understand a little basic. Now, the term budget comes from this French term called boget. The idea of boget is a leather bag. The British, or taking the British legacy, the Indian government, also the state governments use this leather bag to display a budget. You would have seen pictures of finance ministers displaying a leather bag in the idea of a budget. However, with Nirmala Sitharaman coming in as the first full-time woman finance minister, we had what is called the Bahi Khata. Now, Bahi Khata is a traditional Indian idea of a cloth-wrapped bag where financial documents would be kept. Nirmala Sitharaman termed this as doing away with colonial legacy, or what she called as slavery. So, this is traditionally Indian. So, we are expecting a specific question on Bahi Khata, either in prelims or mains. This is very much wanting. So, just know the idea of Bahi Khata is an Indian orientation of having a budget specific. The history of how India adopted budget from the British. 1860 is when the colonial understanding of budget came into India, and further with India's independence, how R.K. Shanmugam Chetty was the first finance minister to present budget. These aspects have been discussed in a previous video on budget history and aspects further. So refer to that. We will now get in specific to the idea of budget, the process of budget, and every related constituents of the idea of budget. So specifically getting in, let's now get into the idea of budget presentation and the aspects related. Having understood the basics related to the idea of budget, let's get into the specific terms of budget understanding. So, budget is a very important idea, we understand. So, the process of budget gets over 3 specific time periods. So, the process of budget can be looked at from pre-budget, the overall idea of budget presentation, and post-budget. What happens in the pre-budget? Pre-budget, there are exclusive consultations held and wide range consultations held nationwide. Now, these wide range of consultations that are held nationwide are carried forward department-wise, sector-wise. Every stakeholder is taken into consultation. Based on all these discussions, data collected, finally collated, the idea of budget making comes into consideration. But idea of budget making specifically is a very secret and a very sacred exercise that is limited to the finance minister and the prime minister. With every department and ministry submitting what is called demand for grants, the finance minister and the prime minister come together to the budget making. This is the pre-budget idea. Now, we also know there is a halwa ceremony that happens when the budget is ready and it goes for printing, and finally the day when budget gets presented. So that is the D-Day. This was generally done on last day of February. The recent reforms in the last few years, we have been seeing that budget is presented on the first day of February. So February 1st is generally the date when budget gets presented. This year, 2024, is an election year. So what have been presented is what is called the interim budget. More details about the idea of interim budget is something that we'll deal with specifically when we go about the idea in terms of what is budget as such. However, we will specifically now deal with the presentation and the process of budget. So what happens on the day of the budget? On the day of the budget, we see that the first thing that comes across is budget gets presented. So once the budget is presented, that is number one. Then you have a general discussion that carries on for a day or two. If we have to understand more specifically, the parliament meets for 3 sessions in a year. One is a budget session, then you have the monsoon session, and then it's a winter session. So effectively, budget session being the first session of a calendar year, the president addresses the session, the date of the budget is fixed when budget gets presented. So in that, budget is presented, that's the first idea. Then comes the general discussion. After the general discussion, we go for a 1 month leave. Now, why did I leave column number 3 blank? We'll discuss that. When the 1 month leave, the parliament reassembles and then you go for a detailed discussion. Why a 1 month leave? We'll discuss that. Now, detailed discussion where there is clause by clause discussion, and finally you go for voting. Now, this is in general as we understand. So, what happens over this time period? If we have to understand these specifics, let us get a little in deep. Generally, the presentation of the budget, we said, happens in February, correct? So, when the presentation of the budget happens in February, with that, the general discussion is about 2 to 3 days. You go for a month leave, so it's approximately March end, and then go for a detailed discussion. This will take about 2 months. The new financial year has started. So April 1st onwards is the new financial year. And mind you, the previous budget has approval only till 31st March. That's how the financial year works. So April 1st onwards, the previous budget approvals don't work. So the detailed discussion generally carries on for a month, 1.5, 2 months approximately. Finally, by the time the budget gets voted, sometime it is end of May or June. Now imagine the government has to function for April and May, which is 2 months of the new financial year before the budget is finally voted. Now that requires 2 months of expenditure. That is the reason why with the general discussion we go for a specific process called vote on account. Now, vote on account is important because it is a process or an idea of seeking 2 months or in general 2 months additional expenditure in advance. This approval is given by the parliament so that it doesn't hamper the functioning as such. Vote on account is a very important idea. In an interim budget, the budget itself is called a vote on account budget. Why? Because the budget is generally for those 2 or 3 months before the election. And once the election is done, a new government is in place, the new government will present a full budget. That is why a budget of the year 2024 was also regarded as a vote on account budget. Coming back, budget is presented, general discussion, then you go for a vote on account. After that, a 1 month leave. Now specifically, what happens in this 1 month? In this 1 month, the department related standing committees meet. What do the department related standing committees do? The department related standing committees do a detailed discussion of what is called demand for grants from every department. So every ministry department has to submit a demand for grant, and department related standing committees are very important parliamentary committees. Generally, every ministry will have one standing committee. Sometimes a small ministry will have 2 standing committees. So in that particular perspective, we see the standing committee going for a detailed discussion of these demand for grants. Mind you, the standing committee will have members both from the ruling and the opposition. That's how demand for grants are part of what is submitted to the department related standing committees. The department related standing committees will do a detailed scrutiny, present a report. That report is not binding. The government can accept, can reject, or can accept in parts. After that, when the budget session reconvenes, there will be a detailed discussion. Now, this detailed discussion is where every clause by clause discussion comes across. Now, this clause by clause discussion is for us to understand whether the parliament is approving every expenditure, every idea that is mentioned in the budget. So, the clause by clause discussion can involve what is also regarded as cut motions. Now, what are cut motions? Cut motions are something generally the opposition bring about, or sometimes even the ruling members can. There are 3 types of cut motions. These are one called the token cut, the other is an economy cut, and third is a policy cut. Token cut is a symbolic measure where the opposition can express displeasure about some expenditure and might request a cut of a token amount of rupees 100 so that it can express displeasure over a particular expenditure. Economy cut is expressing that the money spent would be very high to reduce that money spent. And third, policy cut is expressing displeasure over the entire policy as such. So they would want to reduce the entire policy expenditure to only 100, which means the policy itself remains less useful. So these are the 3 types of cut motions. However, the government in power with the majority would ensure these cut motions are defeated. Budget is a very important idea. The cut motions getting accepted is a severe face back for the government. That is why the government will be present in full strength in the budget session. Further, along with the cut motions, when you go for voting, there is a clause by clause voting that happens. Now, clause by clause voting is accompanied by what is called the closure motions. The closure motions are again of 3 types. There is something called a simple closure, there is something called a kangaroo closure, and there is something called a guillotine closure. Simple closure is where every clause gets voted and closed. Kangaroo closure is where you jump to clauses, and guillotine is at once the entire closure of the entire budget. So this is how the process of budget discussion and budget approval goes by. So this is a simple understanding. Hope you will get a clarity when you listen to the understanding as such. You can definitely post your questions, you can definitely post your queries or doubts. We would be happy to answer. Now, let's understand a little about constitutional aspects related to the budget. Getting into the constitutional aspects related to the budget. It's important because these can be specific questions in prelims. Now, when we look at the constitutional aspect, It is very important to note the term budget is not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. So what is mentioned? Article 112 in Indian Constitution talks about what is called the annual financial statement. So budget in Indian Constitution is the annual financial statement. We don't have the term budget. Apart from this, Article 113 deal with what is called demand for grants. Demand for grants, as we discussed, are very important, submitted by every department ministry. 114 deals with what is finally being voted upon called the appropriation bill. The appropriation bill is, once voted, is a permission for the government to take that amount of money from the consolidated fund. What is consolidated fund? That's coming up ahead. So appropriation bill is 114, which is permission sought by the government to the parliament so that they can spend that amount of money which is mentioned in the budget. Now apart from these three, we also have two more. One is Article 110. Article 110 deals with a special provision of what is called money bill. Money bill is a special type of bill presented only in Lok Sabha. Prior permission of president is necessary. The Speaker of Lok Sabha decides whether a bill is a money bill or not. Money bill is a special provision for the Lok Sabha only. More details will be available in your polity understanding. Apart from this, another type of a bill similar is what is called in Article 117 the finance bill. There are two types of finance bills, Finance Bill 1 and Finance Bill 2, both of them under the idea of money bill. This is the basic constitutional provisions. Apart from this, we just mentioned about accounts. So let's get into accounts, also understand the constitutional provision. So while we understand the accounts associated with the bill, it's important for us to see that the accounts are something that we deal with specific to the idea of budget. Accounts are important because as we deal our finances in accounts, similarly the government also deals their finances in accounts. The first and the most important is what is called the Consolidated Fund of India. CFI or Consolidated Fund of India is as per Article 266. Now the control of the Consolidated Fund of India is with the Parliament. The Parliament is the ultimate controller of Consolidated Fund and the most important account when it comes to the government. Every single rupee that needs to be spent has to be going from the Consolidated Fund, and without the permission of the Parliament you cannot spend anything. But it's a reality that you can't every time go back to the Parliament, and we also have understood the Parliament meets only twice or thrice in a year, which we call as the budget session, the monsoon session and the winter session. So what does the government do? When the budget has been passed, it takes permission through the appropriation bill. Money is drawn from the consolidated fund, and this money is placed in what do we call as the public account. Now what is public account? Public account is an account under the same Article 266. This is under the control of the government, that is the executive of the day. This is controlling the public account. Further, the third important account is what is called the contingency fund. The contingency fund, as the name itself means, is about emergency. The contingency fund is under Article 267, and this is under the control of the President of India. These are the three accounts dealing with the budget as such. The most important, as we have understood, is Consolidated Fund of India, which is 266. Public account is also 266, but it's under the control of government, and contingency fund is 267. It's under the control of the President of India. That's how we understand the idea of accounts. So with this, we have understood the what, why and how of budget. We have also seen the constitutional aspects. We have further understood the accounts in which the budget is dealt with. Budget specifically dealt with need to be understood from the perspective of Article 112. Article 112 is annual financial statement as per the Indian Constitution. As per Article 112, the budget is dealt in two specific accounts. One is the revenue account, the other is the capital account. So what is the difference between revenue and capital part of the budget? When we look at the revenue part of the budget has a fixed time frame. Now, fixed time frame in terms of both the receipts and expenditure, but the revenue part of the budget doesn't necessarily create assets, so it is not asset creating. However, when we look at the capital part of the budget is different. Now, it has no fixed time frame as compared to the revenue, and it generally or necessarily is asset creating in nature. So, from this perspective, we understand the overall idea. So, revenue part of the budget and capital part of the budget under Article 112. Now, let's understand this a little more specifically. Revenue part of the budget, as we understood, deals in a fixed time frame, and capital part of the budget has no fixed time frame. So, how do we distinguish? Revenue part of the budget has what is called receipts. Receipts are incoming, and it has expenditures, and expenditures are outgoing. Similarly, capital part of the budget also has receipts, and receipts are incoming, and it has expenditures, and expenditures are outgoing. What comes under this larger frame? Now, please remember, if you have this framework in your mind clearly, you will remember almost every expenditure or income or the receipt that comes in. You will be able to classify which place this does fall in. Knowing the basics, it's very easy to understand. Specific. Revenue part of the budget, receipts. So, revenue receipts are classified as tax receipts and non-tax receipts. Now, tax receipts are direct tax and indirect tax. We know them. Non-tax receipts specifically are user charges, specifically for all government services, penalties, fines. Apart from that, we also take in the component of grants. Now, those are not loans but grants. Now, this apart, we also take in the idea of profits from government enterprises. Now, there are one or two aspects left which we'll fill in later. Now, revenue receipts has tax receipts and non-tax receipts. Tax has direct tax and indirect tax. Non-tax receipts has user charges, penalties, fines, grants, profits or dividends. Further, the idea of revenue expenditure. Now, expenditure is where we are spending upon on the revenue account. Remember, revenue has no time fixed. Further, it generally does not create assets. So, when we talk of revenue expenditure, these include expenditures of generally termed as what is called the consumption expenditure. So, all the maintenance expenditure comes under revenue expenditure. Maintenance for government, for police, for defense, for fire, every aspect of the government. Apart from this maintenance expenditure, we also look at the salaries, that again is part of your maintenance. Further, what grants that the government gives in. Further, we also can take in the idea of the payments done by the government for all the welfare orientation. So, all this comes in as part of revenue expenditure. I have still left one particular part blank to fill in so that your understanding becomes complete. So, now we have taken revenue receipts and revenue expenditures. Similarly, let's look at capital receipts and capital expenditure. Capital receipts. Now, what is capital? No fixed time frame, but generally asset creating. So, on the receipt sides, which are incoming, when we take in specific consideration, the capital receipts are from the idea of asset sale. What is asset sale? The simple idea of disinvestment. So, disinvestment or asset sale is capital receipts. What else? Remember, the idea of loans, or better known borrowings, also form a part of capital receipts. So, loans are part of capital receipts, but remember, this is a borrowing, this is a debt. Now, if that is capital receipt, what else is capital expenditure? Capital expenditure, yes, is what we spent, but capital expenditure is for asset creation. So, all the expenditure for infrastructure generation. Now, this new infrastructure creation on all aspects of government, be it digital, physical, social, health, education, defense, all aspects of infrastructure creation. New infrastructure creation comes under capital expenditure. Further, apart from this, we also take in consideration the loans that are given. So these are loans given, that is part of your capital expenditure, but loans that are taken are part of capital receipts. Now that we have touched the concept of loans, we need to understand that loans involve a concept of interest and principal. Now, interest is regularly paid, correct? So when we take the concept of loans that are received, so for these loans that are received, we need to pay interest. So that interest that we pay is part of revenue expenditure. Why do I put in revenue? Because this has to pay generally, regularly. So interest payment is part of revenue expenditure for the loans that are received. Similarly, the idea of loans that are given out, which are part here, for these loans we have to receive interest because these are loans that are given out, and since interests are coming in regularly, that is part of your non-tax part of revenue receipts. Now here again the concept of interest comes in. Now, this is interest that we receive, this is interest that we give out. So loans received is part of your loan borrowing, for which we pay interest here. Loans given out, we get interest that comes here. Specific. Now this is interest part of the loan. What about loans being repaid? Now for the loans that are given out, we have to repay, or the person who's taken the loans repays the loan. That comes here. This is loan repaid. The loan repaid comes in here as part of the capital receipt. Who does the state gives out the loans to? It gives out to states, it gives out to union territories, it also can give out to PSUs or also foreign countries. So those loans get repaid, interest get paid. Similarly, for the loans that are received, when the central government receives loans, now those loans also have an interest component that we have seen it here. Apart from that, these loans also get repaid. So that loans repaid have been part of capital expenditure. So this loan repaid is coming out here and the loan repaid is coming here. So this is how we do the connection, and this is how you understand the aspect. So you have to have the clarity that as per Article 112, you have two accounts on revenue and capital. A revenue account has receipts and expenditure, capital account has receipts and expenditure, and this is the table that needs to have a clarity in your mind. If this much is clear, your basics are very much in place. This, my dear friends, is not difficult. It's about understanding and placing very specifically. Now that we have understood the concept of revenue account and capital account of the budget, it's important for us to now touch upon an important concept called deficits. Now, how do you understand the concept of deficit? To understand the concept of deficit, we also need to know the idea of surplus. So when can things be in surplus? When can things be in deficit? Whenever the receipts are greater than the expenditure, so you will be in surplus. Whenever the receipts are lesser than the expenditure, you will be in deficit. That's simple. When you receive more, then you are saving, so you are in surplus. When you are spending more, then you are in deficit. This is the simple concept of deficit and surplus. So in the same manner, where we have understood the revenue and capital account of the budget, depending on the receipts and expenditure, similarly receipts and expenditure, we have deficit components that we need to understand. Earlier, there were two simple components of deficits called the budget deficit and monetized deficit. Now, these concepts have now been done away with, so they are no more in use. So, in that case, what are the components or concepts of deficit that are now in use? We'll see that. So, Four very important deficit components are in use. One is revenue deficit. Revenue deficit is an important concept from an economic health perspective also. Revenue deficit, or in simple RD, is exactly the difference between revenue expenditure and revenue receipts. So when you looked at the table, the idea of revenue expenditure and revenue receipts, the difference between expenditure and receipts is revenue deficit. Mind you, this is minus and this is difference. That's why we use that symbol. So revenue deficit in simple is the concept of revenue expenditure and revenue receipts. Now here comes in the next concept, that is effective revenue deficit. Where did government discuss the idea of effective revenue deficit? This was not originally in use, but effectively after 2012 this has come into the terminology. What is the idea of effective revenue deficit? The idea of effective revenue deficit is based on the concept of grants. The argument of government is grants as part of revenue account also go for asset creation. So they don't want grants to be part of the revenue idea. So effective revenue deficit effectively is revenue deficit minus grants. So this is the simple concept of effective revenue deficit. So effective revenue deficit is revenue deficit minus grants, where revenue deficit is revenue expenditure minus revenue deficit. So these are the two important concepts of revenue deficit and effective revenue deficit. Now let's get to the most important concept of fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is a very important economic parameter. To judge a country's financial health, we take into consideration what is called the fiscal deficit. Twin deficit is an important concept, of which one is fiscal deficit, other is current account deficit, that we deal in balance of payments. Let's take to the concept of fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit in simple is fiscal deficit of total expenditure in difference with total receipts. Now total expenditure in simple is revenue expenditure along with capital expenditure. That's total expenditure. So what is total receipts? Total receipts is revenue receipts plus capital receipts. Now when we take into that table, if you remember, we take both revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. So this idea of total expenditure remains. However, when we take in the concept of receipts, revenue receipts is part, but capital receipts includes the component of loans. So we cannot take the entire concept of capital receipts because loans are borrowings and they are debt. So we will only take non-debt capital receipts. So that's the idea. So when we take the idea of fiscal deficit in simple is total expenditure in difference with revenue receipts plus non-debt creating capital receipts. This is the concept of fiscal deficit. It's a very important parameter for economics and the economic health of an economy. The last concept is primary deficit. What is primary deficit? Primary deficit is to understand what is the real deficit in an economy. Remember, one of the biggest expenditure for an economy, especially like India, is the borrowings and based on with the interest payments. So interest payment is the highest expenditure for the economy. So for us to understand what is the real deficit, in simple, the idea of primary deficit is when we take the fiscal deficit and remove the concept of interest payments from there. So fiscal deficit minus interest payment gives us the idea of primary deficit. So primary deficit is fiscal deficit minus interest payments. This is primary deficit. So we have now understood four deficit parameters: revenue deficit, effective revenue deficit, primary deficit, and fiscal deficit. Generally, we ask the question in terms of arranging them in descending order. So if you understand the basics clear, you should be able to arrange them in descending order. Try this as an answer in the chat box. When you watch this video, we will tell you if you're right. Having understood the concept of deficits, it's important for us to now get into a very important concept called FRBM. What is FRBM? FRBM is a concept of fiscal responsibility and budgetary management. Now, this is to do with what is called fiscal consolidation or the idea of fiscal prudence. For any economy, it's important to be fiscally prudent, and fiscal consolidation shows the discipline in finances. From that particular perspective, India accepted the law on FRBM, so that the first provision of FRBM came about as an FRBM Act in 2003. The FRBM Act 2003 set particular conditionalities, of which, in simple, if I have to understand, the target of reducing revenue deficit to zero and fiscal deficit to 3%. I am not dealing this in detail, but basically it was about these two very important targets. While we talk about these two important targets, it's important to understand what is the timeline. When we launched or accepted this law in 2003, the target was 2009. We were moving towards this. Even though 2004, with elections, a new government came in, the idea of fiscal prudence is something that all governments stand by. So, we stood wise and we were continuously working towards it. However, 2005 and onwards, we see there was global economic crisis, and for 2008 in India there was El Nino, monsoons came down, that created economic crisis, adding up to the global crisis. So, in 2008 we relaxed the conditions and we did away with the targets. But we did not stop there. We relaunched FRBM 2.0. FRBM 2.0 came about in the year 2012, with things being back to normal. In FRBM 2.0, with the same government being in power, the target was now different. Instead of revenue deficit, they introduced the new concept of effective revenue deficit, that is, doing away the grants component. This is where the concept of effective revenue deficit came, and government said they will reduce effective revenue deficit to zero and fiscal deficit to be brought back to 3%. The target was now set to 2015. However, it's important to note the concept of effective revenue deficit was not accepted by the Finance Commission that followed. So even today, when you look at the budget figures, you will have both revenue deficit and effective revenue deficit mentioned. So did we meet 2015's target? Important. We were not able to meet the 2015 target. 2014, new government came about. They did not do away with, but they said 2015 is difficult, 2016. 2016 is difficult, 2017. Now, by the year 2017, a larger debate came about and they said, is it possible? They called the concept of FRBM as a European concept. There were debates about doing away with the concept of FRBM. So, with this, they set up a panel. The then government set up a panel for review. So, in 2017, we see a review panel on FRBM. So, review panel on FRBM was set up, and this panel was chaired by none other than N.K. Singh. N.K. Singh, remember, is the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. So, FRBM review panel chaired by N.K. Singh gave important recommendations. The primary recommendation was to do away with FRBM. They said FRBM can be replaced, and in place of FRBM, they suggested what is called Debt Management and Fiscal Responsibility Bill. So their target was with respect to debt. So they said, let's target debt, reduce the debt to less than 60%. This including the public debt overall. So this is how FRBM has had a rocky road. However, government did not accept this recommendations completely. Neither did it reject. So even today, the concept of FRBM is very much alive. So every time we look at budget consolidation, fiscal consolidation, FRBM ideas come into picture. However, COVID was one time period which literally spelled havoc. So today, if you look at the numbers of fiscal deficit, we are still somewhere close to 5-6%. The government says it is around 2026 where they would try to come back close to the FRBM numbers. This, in simple, is the overall concept of budget understanding. So to summarize, We understood the concept of fiscal policy. So with the concept of fiscal policy and understanding the what, why, how, we went on the idea of budget. The budget basics were looked in the concept of the history, and then we touched upon the idea of presentation, the constitutional aspect of budget, with that all the accounts associated, and then we got into the deficit aspects of the budget, which is important, and then we have also touched in the concept of FRBM and development survey. Hope the idea of budget and the basics, as we have been stressing about, is very clear. So every time you want to understand the basics related to the budget, this can be your one-stop solution. Hope this has made your process of understanding the basics of budget easy. Wait for the upcoming video where we will decode this year's interim budget. The simple idea is about making budget easy. Wait for that. Thank you so much.